Okay, welcome to How to Dig a Trench. I'm Velthacabra. My pronouns are he and him, and today I'm going to be explaining how to dig a trench. So, before we get started, we're going to cover just some basic rules that we're going to make sure that we hit as far as actually what we're looking for in terms of the trenches that we build, right? You can read them off for yourself, but the big ones are always sandbag the trench and always make sure that there are 2 points of egress within, at most, 2 trench lengths from any given point within the trench, right? If you're curious about, any of the terms that I have, go back, watch the primer. The other rules on here are really just for emphasis sake, right? The making sure that you sandbag the trench immediately, sandbag the trenches before doing anything else. We'll get to why that is, right? So let's look at, kind of the basic, minimally viable trench, right? This is a standard trench here. It has to be a standard, not a connector trench, because only standard trenches are able to have staircases in them. So in order to have that 2 points of egress rule, we're going to need a standard trench so we can put a staircase at either end, right? And then we've just got sandbags along the back, right? And if you're curious, none of these rules are necessarily like set in stone or passed down from on high. These are things that I've come up with myself, and certainly as we continue to get into talking about more complex trenches, it's going to become a lot more of an art than a science, and certainly a lot more of kind of an armchair generally sort of thing. But this minimum viable trench, I've dug quite a few of these. They're good. They do what they need to do, which is to say they keep your guys from getting shot and they keep your guys from getting blown up with grenades, right? So, before we get to actually digging the trench, right, you're going to need to make sure that you have checked where it is you're going to be digging the trench, right? What front you're going to be going to, and whether or not they have the supplies that you need in order to safely dig a trench once you get there, right? So, you're always going to want to spawn towards one of the back bases. You're always going to want to get a truck, and even if the front already has the supplies that you're going to want, you are always going to want to bring them more. This is really just me hammering on kind of a topic that I'll get to later, which is everybody should do logistics, even if it's just a tiny, tiny bit, right? Doing a single run of logistics at the start of your play session may not seem like much, but it makes a big difference in terms of what what people have on the front lines. And it's always better to just grab some public kit and move it forward, take the extra 3 minutes to do that, rather than show up to the front lines and find that they've kind of been bare of other necessary supplies. In terms of what you're going to need for your job, strictly speaking, all you need is shovels, B-mats, and sandbags. That said, if you can get them, I strongly recommend barbed wire, engineers' uniforms, and radios, and especially the radios. You're both going to want these for while you're driving the truck, and so that when you actually get there and start establishing, surveillance with watchtowers, so you're going to be able to actually benefit from that. Because you can throw up all the watchtowers you want, if you don't have a radio, they're not going to do anything for you. Alright, so let's say, right, that you've done this, right? You logged on, you got your truck full of supplies, you got a crate of shovels, crate of sandbags, you've got radios, engineer supplies, you figured out where you're going to go, you drive the truck out there, dump it all off, park the truck, right? The first thing that you're going to want to do, right, is grab one of those shovels that you've brought out here, right, and move forward, right, and find a location where you actually want to build. You're going to need this to be kind of an openish area, right, where you're able to actually place the trench down. You're ideally going to want it to be a place where there's already some natural fighting. So, if you don't really know where you're going to put down this trench, a good idea, just start following the soldiers who are already there as they start running out of the base, right? You're going to want to leave a little bit of distance between you and them, so if something dangerous happens, they get shot, because you're not going to have a primary weapon, you're going to have your shovel, right? But they should take you to where the fighting is. Soldiers tend to run towards the nearest combat, towards the first place where they can get shot, and that's probably where you're going to want to build your trench. Once you get out there, you're going to want to probably spend at least a minute, right, just watching combat unfolding. You want to be looking for, where is the enemy coming from? Where are they posted up in? Where do they like to shoot at our soldiers from? Where do our soldiers want to go to? And what you're trying to develop is this idea of, where is it that the enemy tries to shoot our guys? And can I put a trench pretty much right in that spot? Or in a spot that's kind of leading up to there, such that rather than having my soldiers advance across an area where they can just get shot, they can instead advance safely into a trench and then move from there? Or is there a spot where the enemy likes to bunch up that it's hard to attack them, but I could build a trench that we could probably pretty reasonably get into, and from there we could attack those enemies in that position? You're also going to want to look around on your side of the field. Look to see if there are watchtowers in the area. Check your map to see if you've got watchtower coverage over the area where you're planning to build. And really, make sure that you can actually place the blueprint where you want it. You don't have to bother shoveling it to keep it there, because you're going to have a few other steps before you're actually properly digging, but make sure that you can put it down on the ground, because a lot of times it's possible that you'll run out there, you'll find a great position, you'll be super prepared to build, you'll come back out, and you'll find that you can't place the trench where you thought you were going to put it, and then you have to start the whole process over again, except now you might already have supplies brought out, staged, and it's kind of a hassle to move them, right? The other thing is, it's important to be able to place that blueprint down exactly where you want it, because if you can't do that, the area where you are trying to build is not stable. If you cannot reliably and safely stand where you will need to stand in order to even put the blueprint down, you have absolutely no hope of shoveling it, let alone sandbagging it. So, let's assume you find a good spot, right? Your troops keep moving through this area. Sometimes they have sticking points. Sometimes they just get ambushed or fought, right? You've walked up there. You've been able to place the thing down. Everything seems solid. Your troops have pushed further ahead, at least temporarily, right? It's time to start beginning to prep the actual site. First thing you're going to want is a hammer and B-mats. This needs to be enough B-mats in order to build a storage container and a watchtower. The storage container you're going to be building so that you can stage further materials. That is to say, so you can, spend 3 or 4 trips carrying things out to where you're going to build and then put them into the storage container so they will sit there and not despawn. And the watchtower is so that when you check your mini-map, you will be able to see enemies coming, right? Ideally, your troops will have pushed further ahead, at least temporarily, which maybe they're not going to be able to hold it, but they're going to have pushed beyond where you're going to be able to see. And having the watchtower there gives you the ability to kind of, look further ahead than you would normally be able to see and determine whether or not you can continue to safely build, or if you need to kind of take a pause on what you're constructing until the situation kind of resolves itself. I've noted here, you're going to want to try and position both of these things safely. That is to say, in a place where they're not going to get shot, spotted, destroyed as easily. Putting them just kind of in the middle of a field isn't ideal. However, it is better to place them, directly behind where you want to put your trench, rather than put them such that a quarter of your watchtower's circle is going to be, behind you, not effective, because you really need that vision, and this watchtower only necessarily has to protect you up until the point that the trench is dug. Beyond that, it's not going to be like a long-standing sort of thing. Alright. Step 3. And this is the important one. I've already harped on it a little bit, but stage your materials, right? You're going to need enough basic materials in order to lay in 2 staircases, and you're going to need 3 sandbags. Sandbags can only be carried 1 at a time, and you will not, if you have any respect for me or for your teammates, you will not dig a trench and then carry sandbags from your base to that trench in order to sandbag it. You are going to, before you start digging, bring the sandbags up to your storage container, put them in it, and then make sure that that storage container is approximately 2 feet away from where you're going to build the trench, so that the second the trench goes in, you can just turn around, not even have to take a step, and start putting the sandbags on. You're going to want to make sure while you're doing this that you don't carry out too much. It's not really advisable to, for example, I think if you take all 60 B mats and a sandbag and you have your shovel and your hammer, which you don't need those for right now, but say you want to keep them on you, if you carry all these things all at once, as you're walking out there, you're going to be fat walking with the over-encumbered red icon, and this means that if somebody decides that they're going to, if the front collapses or somebody gets around and they see you, you are basically defenseless. You won't be able to run away. You're not going to be able to move with the front. You're going to get run over, and you're going to lose your sandbag. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but every time you lose a sandbag, you're that much closer to having to abandon the fight in order to go make more crates of sandbags, which is a real bummer. It's a whole lot better to keep your encumbrance in the white at most, under the white if you can help it, and to try and be a little bit more nimble and just run away or disengage from any sort of conflict you might see. So, you built your watchtower. You built your storage container. You've done the back and forth in order to haul your sandbags up, right? Everything is ready. Now you place the trench and start digging it. Going to be a tedious process, right? Digging a trench takes a while, but now is the time when you actually get to do that, right? You only ever want to dig 1 trench at a time. Feel free to lay out multiple blueprints if you're planning something much larger, but be careful when you do that. It is entirely possible that other players will come along and dig them all up simultaneously, and the other players are very likely not going to be staging resources for you, and they're not going to be sandbagging trenches as they go along. And if you build a good trench, but you've laid out a bunch of blueprints that got dug up and are poorly built, guess what? It doesn't matter that the one you were working on is good. The other ones are going to fuck it, fuck you, and fuck your team, right? So, I recommend just put down the one blueprint that you actually intend to work on, right? Make sure before you finish digging it also that you do another check to make sure the area is clear. If you have a radio and you have your watchtower still intact, you can check your map to really quickly see, does it look like there's enemies within range? What's the kind of status of the fight? Are we still holding or are we losing, right? Because it's still, even after you finish the trench, even with the sandbags right here, it's still going to take you maybe 30 seconds to fully have that trench prepared as a fighting position. So make sure you check. If you don't have a radio, don't finish the trench. Take out your pistol and run forward and see what the front looks like. Do you have troops up there? How many are there? Are they hard pressed? Does it look like the enemy is coming in? Right? You want to make sure that you do this because it is a really terrible idea to dig the enemy's trench for them. Right? Once you are done digging that trench, you've confirmed you got it up to maybe 96, 97%. You checked your map. There's no enemies within sight. You've determined that it is safe. You finish digging the trench. The very next thing that you need to do, immediately, as fast as you can, is start sandbagging it. Pull the sandbags out of your storage container and start throwing them on. If you only brought as many sandbags as you needed for the job, which is 3, maybe take a breath in between placing them to make sure that you don't misclick, Because if you misclick and leave a hole, again, you're going to have to run back to the base, and in that time, it's possible an enemy gets in there, and you may think, even if, I only left one little hole, what's the worst that could happen? One hole in sandbags is big enough to fit 2 enemies, and 2 enemies is plenty to make sure nobody can safely approach that trench, right? So maybe you want to bring a 4th sandbag if you think you're going to misclick, or you're going to be rushed, or just you don't work well under that kind of pressure. Maybe a better idea is, just before you actually click to confirm that you're going to put the sandbag down, just take a second, count to 1, and make sure that it is actually where you want it to be. As soon as those sandbags are done, please make sure that you put the stairs in, because your troops are, once the sandbags are in, it's safe, but your troops are going to get in there, and the very first thing that's going to happen is somebody's going to throw a grenade at it, right? Having the stairs in there is going to save a lot of lives, and it's going to save lives pretty much from the minute that trench goes into combat. So you don't want to put the trench down and think, I'll get to the stairs later. There's kind of an exception if you're building like a multi-part trench where, say you have like a connector trench and then 2 standard trenches on the sides of that connector trench, and those 2 standard trenches are going to have the stairs in them. Fine. Build the connector trench first, sandbag it, then put in the 2 standard trenches on the side, sandbag them, and then put the stairs in. But really, don't leave the build site, don't start moving on to other things until the stairs are in. And then you can congratulate yourself on a job well done, right? With the stairs in place, with the sandbags up, that trench is now a secure position. The enemy can get into that trench, but they're not going to be able to fight from it. Your troops can approach it and clear it easily. Your troops can use it for cover. They don't have to worry about getting blown up. It's great. You've done basically everything you need to do. That said, you can still move on to sort of embellishing. This is stuff like putting the barbed wire on it, maybe upgrading it to tier 2, maybe continuing to plan and build a larger trench network, right? I don't have too much advice for you here, right? This minimum viable trench, really, it works pretty well at tier 1 with just the sandbags, but hey, if you're getting really crushed by enemies, if the enemies really like using bayonets or stuff like that, feel free. Upgrade it to tier 2, put the barbed wire on it, especially considering upgrading to tier 2 if the trench is in a position where it'd be really inconvenient for the enemy, specifically. Tier 2 trenches cannot be undug with just a shovel. They have to be blown up with mammons or other explosives, and it takes a lot. Though the flip side of that is, make sure you don't tier 2 a trench that's in a bad location. So for example, if you're trying to just shore up the defenses within a town temporarily, until you guys get AI or enough BMATs for the builders to come through and start putting up actual AI defenses, don't tier 2 that trench, because those guys are all of a sudden going to have to spend, 45 minutes clearing that stupid thing away, and a ton of boom that should have gone into your offense. But doing that to your enemy, right? Dropping down a cheap as dirt trench right where they would really love a fighting position, and then making it tier 2 so that they have to physically remove it with explosives in order to correct it, that is great stuff, right? So we're basically done here, but you may be thinking, am I maybe going a little bit too hard talking about the sandbags? No, I'm not. Sandbags are, seriously, the number one thing that you can do in order to improve the trenches that you see in the game. You can dig the stupidest trench you have ever seen in your life, and you can put enough sandbags on that thing that at the very least, it doesn't become a liability for your team, right? And I have seen a lot of people who will dig trenches. They'll dig one, even if they know that they need to sandbag it, they'll say, there's no enemies coming, I'll dig a second one or a third one, or I wanted a bunker over here. They get lost in planning what it is that they want to do, or they get lost in the fun of watching the earthworks go up, or just building things, and the next thing you know, they've been bayoneted, and there's 3 enemies sitting in your trench. And all of a sudden, right, especially if it's on a little bit of a flank, or if these guys have gotten behind your guys, there's not enough manpower to uproot them. They potentially are able to get into the back of troops further ahead, or just to hold off troops that are trying to advance back to positions that they used to hold. It can seriously throw the entire momentum of a fight back against you. And this can be really bad if you're, for example, working towards destroying an enemy spawn point that is set up outside of one of your towns, right? Destroying the momentum on a counteroffensive that might have been able to actually bring enough troops to their spawn point to destroy it, that can potentially lose the entire fight, right? Now, obviously it might seem like a bit of an overstatement to say that, hey, if you don't sandbag your trench the second that you put it down, you're going to lose the fight, but it can seriously happen. And this is especially true because when you go to place a trench, the ideal place to put it is in a spot where your troops would have a hard time, right, fighting in this area unless they had that trench. Because, you know, to go from we're fighting at a disadvantage to we're fighting with an advantage, that's a pretty big difference. Now imagine, your troops are already fighting at a disadvantage at this area. Oh, and also they now have to fight an enemy who's even more dug in than they were before, right? So the more impactful your trench was going to be in terms of the positive effect it was going to have on your team, the more impactful it is when the enemy captures it. This is why sandbagging is so important. And likewise, this is why it's so important to check to make sure that there are no enemies right before you put the last few shovels down. It takes a minute or two to shovel out a trench, and in a minute or two, it's entirely possible for the nature of the front to have changed. These things oscillate quickly, and I can't tell you how many times I've gotten to 80, 90%, only to all of a sudden have somebody show up with a bayonet or a submachine gun to ruin my day. And in those moments, what you think is, oh geez, if I had been even 2 or 3 seconds faster, right, that guy would have had the trench. And see the whole problem about people would have then been, thrown back. It's very easy to defend these things. It's hard for us to attack them. It would have been a whole thing, right? So, cannot emphasize enough. Make sure it is safe before you finish the trench. Make sure you sandbag it as fast as possible. And only once you have it sandbagged and with 2 staircases in it, should you start letting your mind roam to, all right, what is the next thing I'm going to do? Okay? Like I said, this is just the bare bones minimum. How do I build a single length trench, but a trench that will make sure that that my team can use it effectively and that the enemies won't. I know that people are going to want bigger sorts of things, but start small. Start with picking out good places to build these little, compact, and effective trenches. Start getting used to pulling the supplies that you need and bringing them up. Start getting used to staging them. And if you think, this couldn't possibly have that big of an impact, I have built these stupid little tier 2 trenches and spots before that probably ate like 4 or 5 crates of hand grenades from enemies attempting to attack over a bridge with nobody in them, simply because those trenches were placed in such a bad location for the enemy that they would reflexively throw grenades into them just to keep them empty, right? That is a ton of investment from an enemy in exchange for what amounts to 3 crates and 3 crates of things that are maybe 200 BMATs between them, right? So, you may not think that this is much, but it does make a big difference, right? It does make things a lot harder for your enemy. And that mindset of, I'm going to do this one little thing and it's going to create a massive problem for the other team, that is the mindset you really want to cultivate with yourself. That, and when I go to do it, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to do it carefully. So, know this is a shorter one. Good luck. Get out there. Dig some solid trenches. And probably for the next one, it's going to be talking about some obvious things to not do with your trenches. Good luck, everybody.